novels, movies, and plays often have the three-act structure that we've talked about for several weeks. Act 2 is usually the longest segment, where the plot thickens and the characters face growing difficulties before, in Act 3, meeting their ultimate crisis. For example, in The Lord of the Rings, Act 1 leads to the Council of Elrond as Frodo and the others realize their danger and resolve to take the ring to Mount Doom. Act 2 is that whole journey, the pass of Cahadras, Moria, Lothlorien, the voyage down the river, the breaking of the company, the pursuit by Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli, Fangorn Forest, the return of Gandalf, Helm's Deep, war in Gondor, the battle of the Pelennor Fields, and the decision to draw out Sauron's armies in hopeless battle. Act 2 also includes Frodo and Sam crossing the wilderness, encountering Smeagol, turning from the Black Gate into Ithilien, meeting Faramir, Cirith Ungol, and the battle with Shelob. And only after all of that does Tolkien move the story to its climax and resolution. We could do this analysis for almost all stories. Finding Nemo, the original 2003 film, has a very short Act 1 in which the overprotective Marlin loses his son Nemo to a diver's net. Act 2 is the story of Marlin and Dory tracing Nemo to a dentist's office in Sydney while Nemo and his companions try to escape their fish tank. The climax occurs in that office as Marlin and Nemo are finally reunited. Or take The Martian. The author, Andy Weir, was working up a space mission to Mars. He says, I had to account for failure scenarios on the surface mission. How could I design the mission so the crew would have contingency plans? What if they had multiple failures, one after another? While I was working that out, I began to realize their increasingly desperate solutions would make a pretty interesting story. So I created an unlucky main character named Mark Watney and then spent 368 pages making his life a living hell. For the last 2 weeks, we've been in Act 1 of God's big story. We saw that God created the world and made it good, filled with good creatures. Then came the crisis when Adam and Eve, tempted by Satan, made the choice to rebel against God. This plunged them and the whole world into a living hell, a long Act 2 in which God's men and women continually fail and fall into sin. And God, even through judgment, continues to rescue and call men to himself and his ways to shape the whole world toward a greater redemption yet to come. In Act 2, we will hear the promises of the great redemption of sinners through the incarnation, sacrifice, and resurrection of Jesus, and we'll see many other redemptions, some of them epic in themselves, but all of them pointing toward that great redemption. One of the most memorable of those redemption pictures occurs very early in Act 2. When Adam and Eve were expelled from the garden, they began to work the ground and have children. Their first two were Cain and Abel, and it wasn't long before Cain's jealousy led to the first murder. The consequences of the fall were already having their tragic impact. And over the next generations, people did more and more evil. Finally, God knew the time had come for a first dramatic judgment. He had promised death, and now he brought about a judgment of death. Genesis 6, 1 through 7. When man began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they choose. Then the Lord said, My spirit shall not abide in a man forever, for his flesh, his days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And the Lord regretted that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. So the Lord said, I will blot out man whom I have created from the face of the land, man and animals and creeping things and birds of the heavens, for I am sorry that I have made them. So who were these mighty men, the Nephilim, the offspring of the sons of God and the daughters of men? We don't have time this morning to go into great detail on the debate about these verses, but I believe that the oldest explanation is the right one. The sons of God are fallen angels, servants of Satan, who either appeared as or possessed men and took the daughters of Eve as wives. Job, possibly the oldest book in Scripture, uses sons of God to refer to angels. And Job also says, now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. Satan is one of these sons of God, now evil, fallen. Jude 1:6 says, the angels did not keep their own domain, but abandoned their proper abode. They abandoned their abode, they go down among the daughters of men, and the result is the Nephilim, which means fallen ones. The text says they were great or giant men, men of renown, and hints of those carried across the time of the flood to certain peoples on the other side. Numbers 13:33 says, there also we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak are of the Nephilim, and we became like grasshoppers in our own sight, and so we were in their sight. This race of giants either reminded the Israelites of the Nephilim, or they were genetically descended, possibly through one of the wives of Noah's sons. And in response to this, the Lord said, my spirit shall not abide in man forever, for his flesh, his days shall be 120 years. Some people see this as limiting the lifespan of men, though reported lifespans didn't actually drop for many generations. It could be that this is a limit on the lifespan of the Nephilim. But more likely, it's a limit on the whole pre-flood world. It was God saying, I'm only going to put up with this for so long, 120 more years, and then it's over. Then would come the flood. And it wasn't just the Nephilim that triggered this response. Verse 5, maybe one of the saddest verses in the Bible. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Verse 11 says that the earth was corrupt, that it was full of violence. We know this to be true. Paul says of the sin nature that the fruit of it is sexual immorality, impurity, sensuality, idolatry, sorcery, enmity, strife, jealousy, fits of anger, rivalries, dissensions, divisions, envy, drunkenness, orgies, and things like these. This first deep judgment of sin shows us how grievous these things are to God's heart. They grieve him. Verse 6, and the Lord regretted that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. So the Lord said, I will blot out man whom I have created from the face of the land, man and animals and creeping things and birds of the heavens, for I am sorry that I have made them. God was grieved over making man because of this sin, and probably because he knew the price he himself would pay for this sin. But every single one of these people, each one of these sins was a declaration of, I don't need you, God, by people who did need him and refused to admit it. People like you and me and so many in our generation. And the natural result of that attitude was death. If you say, for example, that your body doesn't need food, then you'll end up with sickness and death. If you deny that you need God, the result is equally tragic. But God would not destroy them entirely. Verses 8 to 22. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. These are the generations of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God. Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence. God saw the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way on the earth. And God said to Noah, I have determined to make an end of all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence through them. Behold, I will destroy them with the earth. Make yourself an ark of gopher wood. Make rooms in the ark and cover it inside and out with pitch. This is how you are to make it. The length of the ark, 300 cubits. Its breadth, 50 cubits. Its height, 30 cubits. Make a roof for the ark and finish it to a cubit above. Set the door of the ark in its side. Make it with lower, second, and third decks. For behold, I will bring a flood of water upon the earth to destroy all flesh, in which is the breath of life under heaven. Everything that is on the earth shall die. But I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall come into the ark, you, your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives with you. And of every living thing of all flesh you shall bring 2 into the ark to keep them alive with you. They shall be male and female. Of the birds according to their kinds, and of the animals according to their kinds, of every creeping thing of the ground according to its kind. 2 of every sort shall come into you to keep them alive. Also take with you every sort of food that is eaten, and store it up. It shall serve as food for you and for them. Noah did this. He did all that God commanded him. So Noah found favor in the Lord's eyes. Interestingly, the word favor is the Old Testament word for grace. We got our name Hannah from this word. He was rescued by God's grace. It is not Noah's personal righteousness that caused God to show favor. The grace came first. And then we find that he was righteous and that he walked with God. And don't miss that. God's ultimate purpose was to restore mankind to fellowship in his presence, and Noah had already been given that in some measure. Hebrews 11 tells us that Noah walked by faith. By faith, Noah, being warned by God about things not yet seen, in reverence prepared an ark for the salvation of his household, by which he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness which is by faith. Righteousness. It's a gift given by God to those who trust in him. So in verse 14, God gives Noah a rescue plan. Make yourself an ark of gopher wood. By the dimensions given, this ark is a big boat, the size of a World War II escort carrier. The ark Noah built was 450 to 500 feet long, 75 or more feet wide, 45 or more feet high. It was far from streamlined, built instead for volume. So housing a lot of animals wouldn't be a problem. One calculation I saw said that it could hold as many as 120,000 sheep. It also has a 6-to-1 ratio of length to width, which is the optimum ratio for stability and survivability of ocean-going vessels. You can see all this in the impressive full-sized reproduction now open in Kentucky. But the point is, God has a rescue plan. These verses are not an afterthought. God gives these specific details, what it's to be made of, how it's to be finished, how it's to be roofed and ventilated, how it's to be populated. 2 of every kind of bird, of every kind of animal, and of every kind of creature that moves along the ground will come to you to be kept alive. Noah didn't have to go get them. God had a complete, workable plan, and its purpose was to preserve what God had created, men and animals. Verse 18, I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall come into the ark, you, your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives with you. This is the first use in Scripture of the word covenant, a special agreement between God and man in which God promises specific blessings to his people. In this case, the promised blessing was rescue. Sin grieved God and required judgment, but God's love and God's compassion moved him to provide a way of escape. He's a God of rescue, and we'll see many examples of this in coming weeks in Act 2. When God judges his people, he also rescues a remnant and continues his plan through them. But each of these rescues is also a part of the big story that God is telling of his rescue through Jesus, and they shed light on that ultimate rescue. And what was true for the pre-flood culture is also true of us at the personal level. We are all rebels against God, trying to prove that we don't need him or don't need to take his ways seriously. This is rebellion. It's sin against God. Furthermore, we have hurt those God created. If you don't think that's true, examine your behavior towards your friends and family. Aren't there times you say to yourself, man, I wish I hadn't said that. I don't know why I did that. If I had to do it over again, I'd do it differently. There are those times because all of us have sinned. So God's judgment is just. Sin and rebellion bring death and eternal separation from him, but he's a God of rescue with a rescue plan. And his big idea has always been to rescue us through Jesus. God the Son became a man for that purpose. Jesus lived a perfect, sinless, non-rebellious life. But he died the death of a sinner, being separated from God not by his own sins, but by ours placed on him. Now, victorious over death, he offers permanent rescue from sin. And anyone who believes, just as Jacob did at the Community Pregnancy Center, anyone who believes that Jesus is the only way out of their own personal sin and rebellion and separation receives that rescue. We escape, just as Noah did from the flood. The question is, do you believe all this? Do you know God to be a God who grieves over sin and who judges it and who offers a way of escape, a way of rescue? Knowing this can lead you to faith in Jesus. He is like the ark that we must board in order to be rescued from the flood of sin that leads to death. So what are the elements of God's big story, even in Act 2? Judgment and rescue, but also restoration and promise. We're going to go real fast through the rest of the story. Chapters 7 and 8 show the fulfillment of the plan God just laid out. Genesis 7:11, in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, on the 17th day of the month, on that day all the foundations of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of heaven were opened, and rain fell upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights. On the very same day, Noah and his sons, Shem and Ham and Japheth, and Noah's wife, and the 3 wives of his sons with them, entered the ark. Jumping to verse 20, the waters prevailed above the mountains, covering them 15 cubits deep, and all flesh died that moved on the earth, birds, livestock, beasts, and swarming creatures that swarmed on the earth, and all mankind. God's judgment was comprehensive. We don't know how much the whole earth changed, but the fossil record, often used against Scripture, actually supports the devastating nature of this flood. Jumping into chapter 8, but God remembered Noah and all the beasts and all the livestock that were with him in the ark. God made a wind blow over the earth, and the waters subsided. The fountains of the deep and the windows of the heavens were closed. The rain from the heavens was restrained, and the waters receded from the earth continually. At the end of 150 days, the waters had abated. So God preserved Noah's family and all the living things that were in the ark. And now God begins to restore what has been lost. Verse 20. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord and took some of every clean animal and some of every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. And when the Lord smelled the pleasing aroma, the law said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground because of man. And for the intentions of man's heart is evil from his youth. Neither will I ever again strike down every living creature as I have done. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. So God promises that though mankind continues to be sinful at a heart level, this judgment will never again come on the whole earth. And then chapter 9 shows how God restores. God blessed Noah and his sons and said, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. The fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth and upon every bird of the heavens, upon everything that creeps on the ground and on all the fish of the sea. Into your hand they are delivered. Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. As I gave you the green plants, I give you everything. But you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is, its blood. And for your lifeblood I will require a reckoning. From every beast I will require it, and from man. From his fellow man I will require a reckoning for the life of man. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for God made man in his own image. Be fruitful and multiply, and increase greatly on the earth, and multiply in it." At this moment of new beginning, God repeats his command to Adam and Eve. In Genesis 1, he had said, "Be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the air and over every living creature that moves on the ground. I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth and every tree that has fruit in it, or has fruit with seed in it. They will be yours for food." The most obvious difference between Genesis 1 and Genesis 9 is that originally God permitted men and animals only to eat plants. Here he permits meat also, possibly due to the difficulty of growing food in this post-flood ecology. As a result, the fear and dread of man will now fall on beasts. With the permission to eat meat, there was also given a rule, a restriction. Verse 4, "But you shall not eat the flesh with its life, that is, its blood, in it. The flesh of the animal was given for meat, but the life of the flesh, the blood, was given for sacrifice." Leviticus 17:11 explains, "For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it to make atonement for you on the altar, for it is the blood, by reason of the life, that makes atonement." We'll explore that whole concept of sacrifice that acts as a substitute when we study the sacrificial system later on in Act 2. But we see it here. And finally, man is commanded to revere life. Before the fall, men like Cain and Lamech had no regard for human life, but God now makes a universal rule. Verses 5 and 6, "And for your lifeblood I will require a reckoning. From every beast I will require it, and from man. From his fellow man I will require a reckoning for the life of man. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for God made man in his own image." The life of man was precious and belonged to God alone. So an animal which kills must be put to death, which kills man, and men who willfully kill others must be put to death. By man, it says. God uses a judicial term here to require that governments revere life by punishing those who destroy it. To attack man is to devalue what God most highly valued in the creation process. And so man's life is precious. And doesn't this have compelling implications for abortion and genetic research and euthanasia? The fetus has the life of the flesh in it. To shed this blood, to destroy this fetus, is to violate God's command. And any end-of-life choice that involves taking an active role in the death of a person is a violation of this rule of life. So God makes rules. He makes them for our good. Be fruitful and multiply. Eat what is needed, but have reverence for the blood of the animal, which God will set apart as a sacrifice for sin, and have deep reverence for the life of those created in his image. That's all coming from Noah. And the last verses show God's promises to this redeemed remnant. Genesis 9, 8 through 11. Then God said to Noah and to his sons with him, Behold, I establish my covenant with you and your offspring after you, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the livestock, and every beast of the earth with you, as many as come out of the ark. It is for every beast of the earth. I establish my covenant with you, that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. He's making a covenant. It's an agreement between God and man, initiated by and secured by God. And this is the first of many covenants. We'll see the covenant with Abraham, the law of Moses, which is a covenant with the nation of Israel. There's a covenant with David. In Jeremiah, there's the promise of a new covenant. And like God's many rescues, each of these covenants shows something about the final covenant through Jesus. And they all share certain characteristics. First, the covenant is defined by God. Some covenants in those days were negotiated, but God's weren't. He establishes the covenant, sets it firmly in place. Second, a covenant is defines the parties involved. This one was made with you and your offspring after you, and with every living creature that is with you. Because God had rescued the living creatures, he also included them in these covenant promises. Third, this Noahic covenant is unconditional. Some covenants were contingent about both parties carrying out certain stipulations. In the Mosaic covenant, if Israel kept the law, they would be blessed, and if they broke the law, they would be cursed and expelled from the land. But Noah's covenant wasn't conditional. God would simply give the regularity of seasons and would never again destroy the earth with a flood. Finally, it was typical for covenants to be marked by a sign, like circumcision for the covenant with Abraham. Noah's covenant sign is the most striking of all. Genesis 9, 12 to 17. This is the sign of the covenant that I have made between me and you and every living creature that is with you for all future generations. I have set my bow in the clouds, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. When I bring clouds over the earth and the bow is seen in the clouds, I will remember my covenant that is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh, and the water shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. When the bow is in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth. God said to Noah, "This is the sign of the covenant that I have established between me and all flesh that is on the earth." The sign of the rainbow is so fitting. It's the reflection of the sun in the water of the clouds, the same water which had destroyed the earth, but now is transformed to beauty. Before the flood, there would have been no rainbow, for there had been no rain, we were told. But after the flood, the rainbow assured that the catastrophe would not be repeated. The rainbow and the covenant it represents is for our good, that we might not be wiped out due to our sin, but it is also for God's glory, a physical symbol of his faithfulness, of his rescue. Men and women could see the rainbow traversing the heavens and remember that God is still on his throne and our world is safe in his hands. So what have we said? This is the very beginning of Act 2. Like Act 2 of The Lord of the Rings, this is going to be a long, adventurous time. The choosing of Abraham, the sacrifice of Isaac, the rescue from Egypt, the law, the sacrifices, the kingdom, the exile, the return, and overall, the promise of the Savior, the rescuer. In this long story, we'll see many stories of rescue and redemption, and each one will contribute something to our understanding of the big story and point us to the climax in the work of Jesus. So from this first story, this big truth is that God is willing to judge, just as he promised, for sin is serious, just as he said. It breaks his heart. It grieves him. But when God judges, he also rescues, often a remnant, and then restores and makes promises that show his faithfulness. This is the foundational truth, and we can count on it. And it's one that we will see over and over in God's big story.